Okay, everybody, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you today's webinar from the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit in the Park Technical Assistance Center. Today's webinar is titled Regional Planning to Provide Underserved Communities Access to Public Lands. And I just wanted to let you know of the 5 presenters we have today. We have Jamie Eiswick with the TripTech, Emmeline Sheffield with Chico State, Nathan Caldwell with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, Anita Bueno with the U.S. Federal Services, and then Ben Rasmussen with the Volpe Center. So at this time, I'm going to hand over today's presentation to Jamie, and just so that you are aware, a full bio for each one of the presenters is available for you in the handout section. Jamie, take it away.
Thank you very much. First, I just wanted to go over the agenda that we're going to have today. The first topic we're going to speak about is the importance of connecting underserved communities to public lands. And then Emmeline Sheffield will come on and talk about recreational preferences and some of the research that her and one of her colleagues has done. Then we'll have we'll talk about regional planning for public lands. We'll have some case studies from the Fish Wildlife Service and the Forest Service. And then we'll talk about ideas for deploying similar techniques in your public land, examples of programs that have already been implemented by federal land management agencies, and we'll do a brief conclusion. So first, we have a poll for you.
Okay, the question is, what are the characteristics of an underserved community? So go ahead and select one of those radio buttons. Okay, Jamie, we'll give them a couple more seconds to respond, as we can see the results coming in. Okay, Jamie, I'm going to go ahead, close the results and close the poll and show those results.
Okay, thank you. So as you guys can see, about 90% of you said all of the above, and this is true. Characteristics for an underserved community are demographic, geographic, and economic characteristics that prevent a community from being able to do something. A lot of the times when we hear about underserved communities, we hear about it in relation to health care. But in our case, we're going to talk about it in relation to transportation. So all of the ones that are shown here are characteristics of an underserved community: low income, age, whether it be youth or seniors, mobility impairment, and minority groups. So what are some of the benefits of public lands and some of the opportunities? Public lands provide environmental education. They provide stewardship or responsible management of nature. They provide physical activity for those who are visiting. And we know that physical activity prevents obesity and can help with related medical issues. We also know that about 49% of Americans get less than the minimum recommended amount of physical activity. Public lands also provide for quality family time, whether this is going for a hike, having a picnic, going to learn about the history of a place. It can provide job readiness skills for those who are a part of some of the programs that public lands provide, and we'll talk about some of those in the very last section of this webinar. Public lands can also help reduce stress and promote mental health. Some benefits of nature from the health standpoint are reduced levels of attention deficit order in kids, and also some reduced aggression behaviors. And I want to make sure, I have some feedback on my side. I want to make sure that, Stephanie, you guys can hear me okay?
Yep, Jamie, you sound clear here.
Okay. Now that we've talked about the benefits of public lands, what are some of the challenges? We found that there are correlations between the ease of accessing a public land, how much it's then used, and also the types of physical activity that are able to be done. Some of the barriers to access, some of them we can talk about, are car-free versus car-less. And this will be a big one when we talk about the case study later that's Carless, California. So to describe the two of these, I live in the suburbs of Boston. And if I wanted to go to a public land that's in the city, I myself own a car, and I can choose either to drive my car to Boston, or I can choose to take the commuter rail and the subway, in which case I would be car-free because I chose not to take my car, but I do own one. Carless is the portion of the the people who either economically can't own a car, don't physically have a place for a car, just those who don't have access to a car in general. So there's a little bit of a difference between car-free and car-less when we're talking about it those ways. And underserved communities generally are car-less. They don't have access to a car. Another access barrier is the last mile challenge. It could also be the middle mile challenge. And this is when public lands generally don't have as much volume of people coming to them. So while there may be access via public transportation, it probably won't take you right to the front door or right to the visitor center. So generally there's a gap in the last mile to get you right to where you need to be. And sometimes that gap could be in the middle when you need to change services, such as when I described I was going to take the commuter rail and then would need to get on the subway, and perhaps they wouldn't link up correctly, and I'd need to figure out how to get that middle mile. There are also distribution disparities for public lands. And when we talk about this, it's not just for federal lands, but also for state and local public lands, such as parks. And it's been found that there's an unequal distribution, which is evident in a lot of underserved communities. And this can cause access challenges. Low-income neighborhoods tend to have about 50% less likely to have recreational facilities near them. Use of these public lands is dependent on demographic, socioeconomic, and regional characteristics, and the next section that Emmeline is going to talk about will go into great detail about these. Physical activity, for this, there are a lot of public health concerns. We already talked about the obesity problems. And when we talk about underserved communities, it's been found that the highest rate of obesity is with African Americans at about 44%, followed by Hispanics at 38%, and then Caucasians around 33%. So the amount of obesity tends to go up based on underserved communities. There's also been correlations found between physical activity and park acreage, and I'm going to show you an example of this on the next slide. In Los Angeles, they did a study to find out how much parkland is available per population. And the national guideline says that there should be between 6 to 19 acres of parkland per 1,000 people in a population. When they looked at these communities, they defined a community as being 75% or more of the population in a community. So for the Latino community defined here, it had to have had 75% or more Latino people in that community. The Latino communities had about 0.6 acres of parkland available to them, whereas African American communities had 1.7 acres. And then non-Hispanic whites had 31.8 acres available to them. So you can see that not only is there a disparity between what's available for non-Hispanic whites as opposed to Latino and African American communities, but also that there's a disparity between the national guidelines and what's available to those underserved communities. And next I'm going to turn this over to Emmeline Sheffield from Chico State, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about research related to underserved community recreation preferences. Emmeline?
Well, thanks. Happy to be here today, and I believe this section opens with a polling question as well.
Okay, so the first poll, Emmeline's first poll question is, do you believe underserved communities have different recreation preferences? Okay, Emmeline, as we wait for some of the responses to come in, give them a few more seconds. Again, you're going to just simply press that radio button. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the polls and show the results.
So as we move into this section on what the research suggests about differing preferences, I'd ask you to think about your last experience in a natural place and what its characteristics were. And that'll be a context for the information that I'm going to share with you today. There are differences in recreation preferences both between groups and within groups. And those preferences and behaviors are typically based on social values, group traditions, and demographics. When we as land managers approach the provision of recreation. We tend to do it from a management framework. One of the most familiar is recreation opportunity spectrum. And it's a framework that's an agency. Forest Service pioneered it. It's been adopted or modified by a variety of agencies, but we tend to use frameworks like ROS to identify, classify, and manage outdoor recreation resources. The purpose of this next section, though, is to think about it more from the demand side, from the perspective of the visitor. So a couple of qualifiers before I share some of the research that a colleague of mine has completed recently and is largely consistent with the bigger body of research. Preferences are pretty place dependent. Your own preferences probably vary with the type of experience you're seeking, the time of year, the type of travel party that you're in. And these preferences can be influenced by many factors. It's not appropriate to generalize among ethnic groups. That said, research by Nina Roberts and others identifies some commonly held values between groups and some commonly experienced barriers. So while the preferences are very different, the values and barriers show some real similarities. And this next slide is going to summarize that very quickly. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to touch on all the underserved groups that were introduced in Jamie's first slide. There's a dual focus today on two of the larger underserved groups, people from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds, and the emphasis there because of the growth in that segment of our society. Probably the greatest amount of change as a society that we'll experience over the next 20 to 25 years will come in the changing racial and ethnic background of our society. And then the second one we're going to focus on a little bit deals with mobility, and primarily mobility impairments, partly because of the investments that we've made in response to changes in the law for persons with mobility impairments or other disabling conditions. So some things we have in common before we focus on some areas where preferences diverge. The barriers for folks from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds tend to coalesce around things like access, both transportation and the cost of getting to and from. I think Jamie's slide about the relative availability of public space underscores the importance of physical accessibility, transportation access, and the cost associated with that. There are continuing concerns about discrimination, whether it is perceived or real. It is consistent and common among respondents in focus group sessions and listening sessions from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds. There are continuing concerns about safety and fear, sometimes expressed as just a level of discomfort with the outdoors. Big barriers in terms of communication, simply not knowing what you can do, what's available, how to access it, a lack of knowledge and awareness, a sort of variation on that. And then a workforce that is largely not representative or more uniform than society in general is right now. That's on the barrier side. On the values side of the house, in common, African Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Latinos that were involved in a set of listening sessions conducted by Nina Roberts as part of the Carlos Project, held in common strong recognition of the health benefits of being in nature and public lands, a high appreciation for those nature values, very strong personal values about the natural environment, and a real attention and emphasis on organizing our efforts to make it possible for more kids to experience nature. Bottom line, if you look across the preference findings that I'll be sharing from you, and again, these are primarily from Nina's research, although they are largely consistent with the greater body of literature. Apply findings from the big research or the remote research very cautiously until you can get data specific to the area and the communities that you are trying to serve. So these are the big generalities, and they do reflect this complex interaction of forces that The model on this slide shows you. I'm not going to go through it today in the interest of time, but if you start at the top and work to the bottom, you'll get a sense of a variety of factors that not only influence your behavior, but influence the behavior of every other potential outdoor recreationist or nature lover or visitor. So, from Nina's listening sessions, typically the Latino outdoor recreation experience includes a larger group, more extended families, sometimes 3 and 4 generations. That in turn makes group facilities more desirable, parking for multiple vehicles, picnic tables that can seat more folks, restrooms, larger grill surfaces, the types of things that allow you to enjoy time with a larger group of folks, more likely to recreate at developed sites, more often day use visitors. Picnicking, camping, water play, hiking, soccer are some of the preferred outdoor recreation activities, and spending time with family, an important recreation benefit. When you move over to the communications and constraints findings from Dr. Roberts' research, along with the greater research on Latinos, chief among that 20 years worth of work that Deb Chavez has done in Southern California. Typically, information preferences are to receive information on site, information in Spanish, information sent home from schools with children, working through Latino organizations, and communicating via Spanish language television are some of the preferred communication and credible communication channels. Constraints typically are associated with transportation and lack of information. Moving to another of the fast-growing, in this case, racial groups, the Asian respondents in these listening sessions and focus group meetings also tend to prefer extended family or organized group excursions when they go into nature and outdoor recreation. They highly prize the scenic beauty. Walking, picnicking, volleyball, fishing, and golf are among the most common activities undertaken outdoors. As with Latinos and Hispanics, lack of information is a constraint on greater recreation involvement. Publicizing the health, culture, and educational benefits tend to be among the outreach recommendations for communication. And then the third large group that participated in the listening sessions with the Carlos Project dealt with African Americans and their outdoor recreation patterns and preferences. These respondents tended to focus on social, sport-oriented outdoor recreation patterns in urban settings, more organized recreation, local parks close to city centers. Some of the constraints involved stereotypes on both sides of the experience, and some of the outreach recommendations are to work with local businesses to inform communities about opportunities. So this joins, and finally, Caucasians with a well-documented preference for solitude or small group experiences, secluded, more natural settings, and outdoor recreation preferences that include exercise, camping, hiking, boating, swimming, cycling, and dog walking. The other area we wanted to touch on with you, the 43 million Americans with disabilities, with similar values, reasons, and preferences for outdoor recreation than their non-mobility impaired peers. Experience nature, personal challenge among those more commonly reported motivators, wide range of activities. The biggest outreach effort we can collectively do is to provide really clear information about access so that participants or potential participants with mobility impairments can make informed travel decisions. So when you step back from that particular listening session, those data, and you look at the bigger body of literature about barriers and constraints, there are 5 that are common across all groupings, but they play out a little differently. A large number one barrier across all groups is time, but the way the constraint works out varies a bit with the type of respondent. Sometimes it's time because I'm too busy, lack of time. Sometimes it's I'm working two jobs, lack of time. Sometimes it's I'm trying to master a new language and a new society and a new culture. Sometimes it's I'm at a different life cycle. But time is typically the most commonly reported constraint on people's outdoor recreation behavior. Within underrepresented or underserved groups, discrimination, perceived or real, continues to be a frequently mentioned constraint. It varies a bit in its intensity by the respondent group, but it's a pretty consistent finding. Access broadly defined, whether it deals with the type of facilities or not having the gear or not having a place to store the gear or the complexity of making campground reservations or the other types of things that constrain people's behavior are more routinely mentioned in underserved communities, research on underserved communities than not. Lack of information, both written, verbal, and in a language of leisure, which is the language of home, more commonly reported as a barrier or constraint in underserved communities than not. And then finally, transportation or all the cost associated with getting to and from public lands, whether it's a lack of personal vehicles or poor public transit links, that sort of last mile, first mile, middle mile notion that Jamie introduced in her remarks. So as you think about how to work this information into your work and the work that you do with your communities, there's a wealth of information out there. I've identified 4 that are sort of go-tos for me that I return to again and again and again for different reasons. Starting from the left-hand side to the right, Serving Culturally Diverse Visitors to Forest in California, a research guide, includes a whole lot of what I call Monday morning stuff, things for you to try the very next project, the very next time that you're trying to plan a project or enter into a project that might make your sites, your facilities, your programs more inclusive. I mentioned Deb Chavez by name because she's done the heavy lifting for us all for many, many years on the Latino Hispanic experience, primarily in the Southwest. But anything Deb Chavez does is going to have an immediate application for you as managers, and I recommend almost everything. This Latinos and Outdoor Recreation piece off the link is 4 pages long, chock full of information. The Barr Foundation report on the immigrant engagement of public open space, I go to repeatedly, partly because of its poignancy, and helping me understand as someone who was born in the South but raised in the United States how challenging it is to be in a new place trying to make sense of things. And not only do they talk about that experience a bit based on some listening sessions, but they also bring out some universal or international or cross-cultural design features that you might consider for your work. And finally, the Western States Diversity Project, building relationships with communities of color, kind of dense, as in big and thick, but filled with information that will either challenge your thinking or inspire you in your own work. And that is a bit of a crash course on 40 years of research on recreation patterns and preferences.
Thank you very much, Emmeline. At this point, we're going to take a break and give you an opportunity to ask either Jamie or Emmeline a question if you happen to have one. Emmeline, it looks like we do have a couple questions right now. So let me ask you the first one. What was the intent of Nina's research and who commissioned it?
So Dr. Nina Roberts is a faculty colleague at San Francisco State University, and as part of the Carlos, California project that you'll be hearing about later in this webinar from Anita Bueno, subscribing to that first principle of design with, not for, something I'm very grateful to Deb Chavez for simplifying design with, not for. As part of our Carlos, California project, Nina conducted listening sessions in 9 communities in the Bay Area, 5 communities in the Bay Area and the Central Valley to provide us with some information to take into our Carlos, California planning. And that technical report from her findings can be found on the Carlos, California website.
Okay, we have one more question. How can I find out more about diversity in my area in terms of race, ethnicity, age, and mobility and disability?
Well, your easiest quick answer is to go to the Census Bureau. Between the 2010 census and the ongoing American Community Survey, you can now get information down to the census tract level on the demographic communities that you are trying to serve. In addition, there's this whole wealth of new visualization tools where third-party providers or other entities are using census data and their own research to do graphic representations of almost everything. Depending on the particular community you're trying to serve, start with the census, and then look at some of the visualization websites. I got a list of links to some of my favorites. We could follow up with that, or I could post it after the webinar is over.
Okay, and then we have one more question before we move on to Jamie. It says, we are preparing to conduct focus groups. Do you have any documents to share?
You know, there are probably the simplest ones that I can recommend to you quickly would be on the National Park Service website. Their social science website has a set of guidelines for conducting focus groups, and they're designed not so much from an academic get it published for promotion purposes point of view, but from a credible inform your decisions and again work with not for in your programming efforts. So that's where I typically send folks when they're doing work like that, and I'll pull that link up for you and get it back to the webinar managers and they can distribute that.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Emily. We do have a couple more questions in the queue, but we'll either save them for the next question break or a little bit later in the webinar. At this point, I'm going to hand the webinar back over to Jamie.
Thank you very much. Now that we've defined what an underserved community is and why it's important to connect these communities to public lands, and Emmeline has shared some of the common recreation preferences, what those are, now we're going to talk a little bit about how to use this information in the transportation planning process. When we talk about, again, about looking at underserved communities and them being car-less, one of the things we think about is how to plan using alternative transportation systems or something other than a private vehicle. And alternative transportation systems can be anything from a bus to a ferry to even non-motorized, so being able to walk or use bicycles. And how to plan for these in public lands is unique. And this is because it's not just getting people from point A to point B like you do in most other transportation places. You have to consider the visitor experience in a public land. Also the demographics of the people who are going and who are using these. It's people who are using it for recreational travel and not just to go to work or to get to the grocery store. So you're going to have a lot more families and not just adults. They also have to take into consideration supporting the public land mission. Again, for public lands, it's not just transporting people from point A to point B. There needs to be some concessions for making sure there is a good visitor experience, that there's interpretation on board, that you're also trying to improve and keep alive the resources that are available in a public land as well, and making sure that ATS does not disturb those. Most likely a public land is also in a low density area and has lower volumes of people riding the alternative transportation system. So this needs to be taken into account as well. So some of the planning goals that we're going to talk about would be the first one we've talked about several times now, to connect underserved communities with a public land. Also to identify transportation not only to the public land, but also within the public land as well. We don't just want to be able to get someone there. We need to make sure that they can see the sites once they're there as well. And then also to address the constraints that Emmeline has described for us. And those would be not only transportation, but time constraints, discrimination constraints, access, information and also cost. So how do you do that? First, you need to put together a planning team, and your planning team should be multi-agency and cross-jurisdictional. You want to make sure that this interdisciplinary team that you put together has everyone on it, from engineers to planners to recreation staff, your interpretation staff, landscape architects. Make sure that you have everyone on your team, because everyone brings a different skill set from a public land. And they also bring different visions. And this will allow you not only to collaborate, but also when you're looking at people outside of the public lands as well, it's going to allow you to share funding and resources. They've found, and you'll see this in the fish wildlife case study later, that it will also help you with regional consistency when you're moving from one region in your public land to another. Some stakeholders that you're probably going to want on your team when doing planning. All of the public lands representatives, if you're doing a full region, which will also be discussed in Carlos, where they used all of the public lands, so Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Fish Wildlife, National Park Service, the Army Corps, all of these were involved as stakeholders. You want to make sure you have your departments of transportation, metropolitan planning organizations that are in your area. Also, if you decide to include regional and state parks, you're going to want representatives from those areas. Local community groups, this can be things such as school groups that already have some type of program available for underrepresented groups. And then also technical experts, and these would be people from the universities such as Emmeline and her colleague Nina that she talked about. Technical assistance centers that are available, such as the TripTac, the Volpe Center, and others such as the National Park Service Denver Service Center. So first, when you start this, after you've identified your planning team and your stakeholders, you're going to create a memorandum of understanding with the stakeholders, and this will help you define what the roles and responsibilities will be of each stakeholder. Then you're going to identify your project vision, goals, and objectives. And basically this is what the end game is of your project, what you're hoping to get out of your project, to make sure that when you start it, you know what you'd like to get out, and make sure that you have a checklist to go through each piece. Then you're going to determine your project boundaries, and these can be defined in two ways. You're going to have your conceptual boundaries, which are the type of lands that you're going to include. So do you want to just include the federal lands, such as the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish, Wildlife, Forest Service, and Army Corps? And also, I left off earlier, the Bureau of Indian Affairs lands as well. Or do you want to also include your state and local parks in this project as well? Then what types of alternative transportation systems would you like to include? Do you just want to do motorized, or would you like to include non-motorized, such as trails for bikes and pedestrians as well? And then the second type of project boundaries are going to be the physical and geographical boundaries. And in the Carlos example, you'll hear about this, where they were originally going to do the entire state of California, and then they had to choose to start smaller and do just the Central California piece. So they had to figure out where the northern boundary and the southern boundary of Central California project would be. And this may be the same in your area as well. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the process, and I'm going to walk through this process in general, and then in a little while we're going to hear case studies of how this was implemented in more detail and how it was put into place in Fish, Wildlife, and Forest Service. While there's no silver bullet for planning, this is one process that can be used, and it's been successfully used in the public lands already. The process that was used for Carlos, California is what I'm going to talk about, and it was based off of the process that was started for Fish Wildlife, and it was expanded upon using the U.S. Bicycle Route System National Corridor Plan process that was done in part by Adventure Cycling. Some other processes that you could use as well would be those done by metropolitan planning organizations for doing their regional transportation plans, and also the long-range transportation planning done by federal land management agencies. So if you look here, there are 3 levels of planning detail that have been planned for the Carlos, California regional planning. The first tier is regional networks. And in this, it has origins and destinations, as well as those links in between them. And that's this first graphic on the top. The second tier is more detailed, and this is once you've already picked your origins and destinations, and it's the transit corridor going in between those origins and destinations. And the third tier is even more detailed, and this is a station area design and implementation, and this would be one particular station that an alternative transportation system would stop at. We're going to talk about, for this webinar, Tier 1 and the regional transit networks. So in Tier 1 in the regional transit networks, it was broken into three pieces again. The neighborhoods, which in our case we're talking about underserved populations, and these will serve as the origins. Then the destinations, and then the alternative transportation system piece. And this is just another flowchart to show you how this was done. So to improve the access to public lands, first it was to identify the underserved communities or hotspots, or neighborhoods or origins, however you'd like to call this first piece. The second piece was to identify the preferences for the underserved communities and the destinations at these the destinations that these preferences were used for. The third piece was to find the alternative transportation systems that go in between these origins and destinations. And the last piece was to identify the gaps between the neighborhoods, destinations, and alternative transportation systems. And I'm going to show you a very detailed flowchart here about how this planning process was done. This first piece on the left is the neighborhoods or the origins, and the very first thing that was done was to establish filters. These filters are what we talked about earlier on, about the demographics, social and economic characteristics that are going to be found. Once you've figured out which filters for those three that you want to use, you will map these to identify what your potential target neighborhoods are. And while I'm talking about this in a very general sense right now, next section, when we look at the Fish, Wildlife, and Forest Service case studies, they're going to show you the actual maps so that you'll get a better understanding of how this was done. Once the target neighborhoods have been found, we chose prioritized list of target neighborhoods, and these were the neighborhoods that had the highest need according to these demographic, social, and economic filters that were used. And that final prioritized list was used as the origin of our trips. The second piece in the planning process was to figure out where the destinations were. The first piece that was done was to identify the target population recreation preferences, and this is the research that Emmeline talked about. After the research was looked up, however, in the case of Carlos, California, they used focus groups, and this was to be able to make sure that the research that had already been found was going to be consistent with the locations and neighborhoods that we chose, because we know, as Emmeline spoke about earlier, that the preferences are based on place and very dependent on the place. So the focus groups helped to make sure that the information we were using was consistent with our area and our neighborhoods. Filters were then chosen for the destinations, and the ones that these could be such as transportation types that people were willing to use, amenities that they wanted at their destinations, recreational opportunities that they were looking for. The destination piece was a little bit different from the neighborhoods, in which we had to first identify the target destinations. For the Carlos, California case, it was used only federal lands were used. State and local parks were not included in this list. Once the destinations were found, all of the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Fish, Wildlife, Forest Service, Army Corps, and Bureau of Indian Affairs lands that could be used for recreation. That big list was used then to map it against our filters and figure out rankings of which destinations were able to provide these recreational preferences that the target populations wanted. And these were mapped, and then we were able to come up with a prioritized list of destinations and take some of the low-hanging fruits so that we can use those as prioritized lists. The third piece was to identify what alternative transportation systems existed and map those. These were mapped and found by using things such as Google Transit, information from transit agencies themselves, Amtrak, 511 systems that were available, local transit websites, and also public land websites. A lot of the public lands had how to get to our public land via public transportation on them. So that's how we found all the alternative transportation systems. Once these three pieces were found, we put them all together to identify corridors between them and how to get from an origin to a destination using alternative transportation systems. Gaps were then identified in these corridors, and we also made sure that we were looking at a suite of solutions, so not just linear ways to get from point A to point B, but possibly there could be loops, or there could be more than one way to get from point A to point B. And then a proof of concept field test was done to see how long it would actually take to put into play the corridors that were chosen and where some of those gaps may be, if there was a middle mile missing, a last mile missing, and those type of things. Now we're going to have some case studies presented to you to go into more detail and show you examples of how that planning process was put into place. The first one will be the Fish Wildlife RATES, and RATES stands for Regional Alternative Transportation Evaluations. And then you will hear about Carlos, California, which was a little bit more detailed in their underserved community demographic work, but it was built off of what had been done by the Fish and Wildlife Service previously. And Carlos, California stands for the California Alternative Transportation for Recreation, Leisure for Everyone that is Seamless and Sustainable. And I also have a few resources for you as well. TripTac has a planning resource webpage which includes a list of stakeholders, which is much more detailed than what I provided in the slides. So you could go to this web link if you're interested in getting more information on that. TripTac also has a previous a document listed on our website that could be useful for you that's called Transportation Planning Process for Transit and Federal Land Management Agencies, as well as a training that was done based on that guide. And both of those links are showed here. I believe we have also included a handout for you that includes all of these links that you can download the handout as well. And Stephanie, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Okay, I think we'll skip this break and hand it right over to Nathan.
Okay, thank you. Am I on? Everybody hear me?
We are. We can hear you,
Okay,
Nathan.
Good. Nice to know the technology is working. Yeah, I'm Nathan Caldwell. I'm the Transit and Trails Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our small transportation program. Well, I like to use the word transit and trails and not so much alternative transportation because Americans have been riding bikes and taking buses and streetcars for a lot longer than driving cars. And it's nice that we're coming back to those. But as Jamie mentioned, we are doing what's called Regional Alternative Transportation Evaluations, rates. We like them better than RATs, which were the original term, which was Regional Alternative Transportation Surveys. So, and what these do, as you can see on the slide here, is we determined that we really needed to incorporate alternative transportation systems into our long-range transportation plans. And the federal land management agencies, along with the Federal Highway Administration, the Office of Federal Lands, are doing regional transportation plans for all the federal land management agencies that have programs with the Federal Lands Highway Administration. And that is Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service. Now the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Land Management are full partners in that as well. Forest Service as well is joining in a more agency-specific fashion. But so what we look at is how our facilities, both hatcheries and National Wildlife Refuge System units, are connected to the communities and within their own boundaries. And we look at transit and non-motorized transportation. So that's pedestrians and, in some cases, water and bicycle. And so these rates provide baseline data on what's out there now. We look at opportunities and constraints, and we look at all refuges broadly. We identify a few specifically and looking at them more deeply, but some opportunities just aren't there, and some constraints are too large for us to really consider these. And so we have to accept that sometimes the only way to really get to some of our more rural and remote refuges are going to be by private vehicle. But where those constraints don't exist, we see, well, how can alternative transportation systems be more broadly instituted? And we actually do have some evidence from our visitor surveys visitor satisfaction surveys that we do periodically, and we do have transportation questions in there, and close to 50% of people, not quite 50%, said they'd be open to using bike share, using transit, and water-based transportation. That was one of the most popular ones. So some kind of boat shuttle going up and down rivers and lakes on our refuges. We have quite a bit of those. So here's the rate process. You can see we do an underserved population analysis, and you all saw what that included. And we picked, we wanted to find out what was around us and decide what we could concentrate on. So we're looking at the presence of refuges close to underserved populations, that broad definition, and then what's the availability, both in motorized transit and trail, and waterborne in cases as well. We chose, excuse me, we chose 3 demographic variables, and you can see them: household income, car ownership, which is not as high as you might think. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a quick sip of liquid here. Thanks. And percentage of non-white population, a lot of times that correlates with income, not always though, as Evelyn pointed out, really can't stereotype here. And we may, based on what Carlos California's done, is include food stamp recipients into that, and they'll go into that more during their presentation. And then this information was used to create thematic maps along with a transportation network. So we overlaid demographics on the transportation network, and we may indicate hotspots where some of these things actually come together, and you'll see that in Carlos, California, too. These are some of the outcomes. We've been able to prioritize our projects and our project selections. And our number one goal, of course, because we are the Fish and Wildlife Service, is environmental and resource protection. That's the number one goal of all of our transportation projects. And of course, environment and resource protection includes lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's where a lot of our transit and trail stuff comes in. We want to improve visitor experience where we can with transportation. We want to have a safe and well-performing transportation system, and one that might be seamless with our neighbors. That takes working with our transit providers and trail networks across the country. And then also partnering and planning, and we'll get back to where these are bearing fruit. We do include visitor experience because transportation is one of the major impacts on how people experience our refuges, how they get there, and how they get around. And we also really need to expand our visitor opportunities for underserved populations. As we've heard already in this presentation, land management agencies have a lot of challenges across the board when it comes to getting and retaining what we call our non-traditional visitors. So how do we include people with low incomes? How do we include people of diverse racial backgrounds that may not consider coming to the public lands? How do we, and you'll see there's a very complex relationship here. And also low car ownership. I mean, how do we deal with that? For example, Modoc County in northeastern California has the second poorest county in California, but it has it's tied with LA County and I think Orange County San Francisco County as the 2 counties with 10% of the people don't own cars. It's a very rural place. So how do people get around a rural county without a car? And if we want to attract them to the national forests, the national parks, wildlife refuge, and BLM lands, how do we get them there? And the picture here is a good opportunity to show the partnership between a local transit system and a refuge. That's a bus stop, whoopee. But right behind it is the entrance sign to Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge on Long Island. And so the local transit provider worked with the Volpe Center and the refuge and got us not only a bus stop, but made sure that bus stop was identified in their transit map, as well as in the light rail or the heavy rail system that comes out from New York, so that we can say on the refuge website and on the transit website how you can get to Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge without a car from a lot of places in the New York metro. And again, there's a changing relationship with driving. This is becoming more and more evident, and there's more studies to show it. The one I quote down here, and I encourage you all to download it. It's not very long. But it's showing that more and more, especially young people, are not driving as much for various reasons. A lot of it has to do with the Great Recession and expenses, and more people are choosing to live places where they don't need a car. And that has real implications for a lot of things. Transportation funding among them, implications for federal lands visitation, and then rural communities too. If you would love to live in a rural community, but you can't get around without a car, or it's too expensive to own a car, how do you keep rural communities livable and vital for that population? The link is here. Cut and paste it, do a search on it, and you should be able to find it. Moving on to our actual rates, accessibility for underserved population. First, and you're going to see an urban edition of this and a more rural edition of this. The urban one here was done and both of these are from what we call our Region 3 long-range transportation plan. Region 3 is the upper Mississippi and Great Lakes area. So you see here a rate for the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, which is in Bloomington, not far from the Mall of America. You can see a very complex transportation infrastructure. The purple is bike lanes, the dark red are interstates, the blue here is, no, let me give her, excuse me, using the actual pointer. The blue line here, is this showing up, Stephanie?
No, you gotta push the button and hold it.
Okay, all right. Now is it showing up?
No.
Rats. Not right now. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Sorry, folks. But you can see this is the light rail line. It starts in downtown Minneapolis and goes to the Mall of America, and you can see the Bloomington Visitor Center is like the third stop or something from the southern end of the line. And Ben Rasmussen, who lives in this area, can tell you about the other light rail system or heavy rail system that's going in up here. So there's the infrastructure for the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities area. Here's some of the more underserved populations, median household income. You can see the yellow circle there. You can see the concentration in downtown Minneapolis up on the top of the slide. Medium, and then vehicles per household, a lot of correlation there as well. That's the lower vehicles per household, ones that are circled. And then non-white. Again, there's an overlay. For us, if we want to get people to our refuge that are not Caucasian, they're pretty close. We can get them there on bike. We can get them there on light rail. They can actually drive. We just got to make it attractive and get people out there. And right now what we are doing is the refuge there is leading tours based on the light rail, meeting people in downtown, taking them on light rail, getting off and doing the short half-mile walk to the Refuge Visitor Center. So we are taking advantage of some of this rate information already, as you saw with the Wertheim one, too. That's the result of our Region 5 or Northeast and Mid-Atlantic rate that's been done recently. And here's one for a more rural area. This is in downstate Illinois. Well, it's somewhat near Springfield, the capital. And you can see this is for Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge. It's there in green. And you can see a much less dense transportation infrastructure. You got some state roads there, National Highway System 51, an interstate, and some bike lanes. Not all that complex. quite different than Minneapolis. So medium household income. For us, that looks good. The lower income folks are not that far from the refuge. But again, how can we get them there? Perhaps they have transportation limitations. And out here, how does the rural transit system fit in here? Questions we need to answer more of for the long-range plan for the region and projects for the refuge from our federal land transportation program. Again, vehicles per household. Again, see, we've got the underserved population, the medium household income rather, is rather low. Vehicles per household also rather low, just outside the refuge. But again, can they ride their bikes to us? Can they take a bus? Could they even walk to some places? Looks like they could if we have a good trails network laid in there. Again, grounds for further analysis. And here we go. And then, again, non-white population, see, it's a little bit skewed, doesn't overlay the same with the low income and low vehicle ownership. Again, this might be some age differences in here as well. But again, at least we know where those populations are. We know how we can try to reach them. And again, they're not too far from the refuge. How do we analyze our visitors already, and this will help us try to reach out to these populations even more. So, and that's what we're doing, how we're using the rates. As I said, we're already accomplishing some of the goals there that I illustrated with the Minnesota Valley and also with Wertheim. Other opportunities are already taking place like that. Just today I had an email request from one of our visitor services managers in our Region 1, which is from Refuge around the Portland area, and Metro in Portland, their alternative transportation provider, wanting to know more refuges across the country that are accessible by transit. We have a lot of examples, and we're getting a lot of this stuff on our refuge websites so that people can see how to get to us without a car, and we're going to continue that effort. We have completed long-range transportation plans with the rates incorporated in them in our Region 1, which is our Northwest and Hawaii region, Region 7, which is all of Alaska, and all the LRTPs are done there with all the agencies. It was, as folks in the audience may know, it's the only region and state that has the same boundaries, so we're able to collaborate on a long-range transportation plan. As I previously mentioned, our Region 3, which is the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes, is also done with a rate in it. Right now we've done rates, and we're incorporating them into LRTPs for our Region 6, our Mountain and Prairie region, and Region 5, our Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region. And you see the fruits from that at Wertheim, as well as John Hines Refuge in Philadelphia and Occoquan Refuge. It's only about 10 miles south of me here in Arlington, Virginia. And upcoming, we got some really big ones. Region 4, our Southeast region overlays closely with the Park Service Southeast region, and we're doing some collaboration there on both the rates and our LRTPs. A lot of refuges there, a high population concentration and use of visitation. And so that's just getting kicked off with a lot of back work, as well as our Region 8 out in California and Nevada, and I had some participation in that myself. So that's where we're going with this. One of the things that we were very, really sad about with MAP 21 was the loss of the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit and the Parks program. So there's no specific program for alternative transportation, even though under MAP 21 now the federal land transportation programs that each of the agencies has, alternative transportation, transit, and trails is eligible, as well as for the federal land access program, and that even has operating money allowed under it. But again, these aren't quite serving the needs of alternative transportation because of the huge backlog of infrastructure needs for our roads, parking lots, trails, and bridges that those programs also pay for. So with that, I believe I am finished, right? Yep.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. At this time, we'll stop for some questions. If you have a question and would like to use the Q&A manager, simply select Q&A, type in your question and hit ask, and we'll put it into, you'll be put into a queue. Or if you're on the telephone and would like to ask a question, simply press *8 on your telephone keypad. Nathan, it looks like we do have a question in for you already. Are there many NWRs in urban areas across the country, and can they be accessed by transit or multi-use pathways?
Thanks for the question. Yes, as I mentioned, we have several across the country. Our largest one is one I did not mention was the San Francisco Bay Refuge Complex, particularly the refuges act that we're looking at improving access to is our Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge in Newark and Alameda in the South Bay. We actually have a transportation scholar funded by Federal Transit Administration and by our Federal Land Transportation Program, who's starting his second season out there. So that's one refuge that we're building up. Also, Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge in South Portland metro area is the only one that we know of that actually has a bus stop on refuge land itself. Several other refuges in the San Diego complex, South San Diego Bay, are right on bus lines. One is accessed solely by bus. We're pointing out Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge, Occoquan Refuge. South of us, we've got one going in at Featherstone Refuge. We've got some land issues to work out, but that'll have an access right off a heavy rail. The Virginia Railway Express will have that access there. John Hines Refuge in Philadelphia is another one where we have both bus and heavy rail access available, and these are on our websites, and there are others. If you want those specifics, I'll be glad to get a further list and post it.
Okay, and it looks like we have a specific question. This person was wondering who is the contact for the LRTP for Region 4, and how can we contact them? This might be something we can shoot them an email to let them know specifically, but I'll let you answer.
Sure. It's the Regional Transportation Coordinator for our Southeast region is Joanne Clark at Joanne_Clark, Joanne without an E, Clark without an E, I believe, at fws.gov, and we can get you the correct email address to you. Also, we're in the Volpe Center is helping with that as well. We'll be glad to, as well as Eastern Federal Lands Eastern Federal Lands Highway Division is also helping with that LRTP, so we can be glad to get you that contact information.
All right. Okay, we don't have any other questions, and at this time, we'll hand the presentation over to Anita and Ben. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to present Carlos, California to everyone today. Keep in mind that it is a work in progress, but today I'm going to be going through an overview of the project structure and talk a little bit about the methodology we used as well as the preliminary findings. Ben will be covering more of the technical details. So, as Jamie was saying earlier, the vision of the project initially was regional in scope. It was statewide. We wanted to look at alternative transportation planning from the 30,000-foot level. But due to funding and the complexity of the project and due to the vast cultural diversity that is California, we ended up breaking the project down into 3 geographical phases. Phase 1, Central California, is where we are now. We're at the process of just wrapping it up. Phase 2 is Southern California, and Phase 3 is Northern California. So with this project, not only do we want to extend opportunities to underserved communities, but part of the vision was to advance a seamless service approach. And we really wanted to develop outdoor recreation services that cross the boundaries of agency jurisdiction. And in order to do that, we needed to develop a team organization that reflected the idea of seamless service and inclusiveness. The structure had to be flexible so it could accommodate new voices and it could change over time, but it also needed to be decisive so we could keep moving forward. So we developed this organization where we had a core team staffed by Forest Service faculty, Forest Service and CSU faculty. And these guys were basically the architects of the project. And then there was the extended team, which included all the other federal agencies, which were our partners in this. Tech support came from TripTech and the Volpe Center, along with other folks that sat at the table, including Caltrans. And there were a variety of other agencies that were our partners, as well as stakeholders, including California State Parks, East Bay Regional Parks. There was local nonprofit groups, and we really wanted to have the meetings open to anyone who was interested. So ideas proposed by the core team were vetted by the extended team and others, and all the decisions were made as a group, and pretty much everyone at the table had a voice. So this is the flow chart that Jamie earlier went through, showing our project methodology. I'm not going to go through it again, but I really just wanted to again reiterate the three legs of the stool: the neighborhood leg, the destination leg, and the transportation leg, and how all three of those kind of held the project together. We started with the neighborhoods. The Volpe Center assisted with collecting and making sense of all the socioeconomic data, and I'll let Ben take it from here to describe that process.
Thanks, Anita. So I'm going to talk about how we determine what neighborhoods to study as part of the Carlos, California project. And first, we considered the process we used to create the Fish and Wildlife Rate Underserved Population maps. We then looked at using more different filters that were important to the Carlos, California team. And we then weighted each filter and developed a needs index to reflect the sum of each weighted filter. Finally, we mapped the needs index and identified target neighborhoods for our study. I'll now walk you through this process in a little more detail in case your region is interested in pursuing something similar to what we achieved. We began by testing the same approach that we used in the rates in two areas in Central California, the Bay Area and Fresno. Here's the Bay Area map, and as you can see, the results were similar. For each demographic filter, there were sometimes different and sometimes similar concentrations in various areas of the maps. Here's non-white populations, Hispanic populations, median household income, and vehicle ownership. So with so much ground to cover in the region, we soon realized that generating each of these maps for every medium to large-sized town in Central California would be a bit overwhelming. So instead, we developed a single index map that combines all the filters identified as important to the team. The precedent that we built upon here was work that the Trust for Public Land in Minnesota did for Minneapolis. This is a map showing that in this map. So to perform the needs analysis, we first asked the Carlos, California extended team to list the kind of filters they would like to see used in the study, and this was the list they developed. We asked each team member then to vote on which filters were most important to them. As you can see, median income and minority were the top vote getters. After receiving this input, we did some research to determine which of these filters had complete data sources available for all of California. And at the time, free reduced lunch and public health did not have a data set that we could use. So we then identified census food stamp recipient data as a proxy for free and reduced lunch, and we put age back into the mix, and then we redistributed the votes and weighted the filters accordingly. Next, instead of just adding up the whole number scores for each filter, we calculated their incremental value and summed them. This counteracted any rounding error and ensured a higher degree of accuracy in our index maps. We created an index map for the entire Central California region, which is on the next slide, and identified 9 areas to zoom into. Sacramento, Bay Area North, Bay Area South, Stockton, Modesto, Merced, Monterey Bay, Fresno, Bakersfield, and Visalia. Here's the map of the region, and you can see that there are high-need census tracts shown in yellow in almost every medium to large-sized city in the region, as well as some rural areas. And census tracts in rural areas are larger, so they pop out on this map even more, even though the population in these areas is very dispersed. After creating the 9 zoomed-in maps, we asked each member of the extended team to place a dot on the high-need clusters or the neighborhoods that they would like to see included in the study. spots to least of 11 clusters/neighborhoods. And listening sessions were scheduled for 4 of the top 5, East Oakland, Visalia, Stockton, and South Sacramento, as well as for Bayview, Hunters Point, and San Francisco. And all the neighborhoods were used as origins for the destination analysis, which Neil will describe in just a minute. We also, based on our census data, created demographic profiles for each of the selected neighborhoods, and we colored those in red on each of our maps. To bring our work full circle, we finally created index scores for each of the selected neighborhoods to see how they compared. This information helped the target team's work to identify priority corridors for our next phase of work. I'll now turn our presentation back over to Anita. Anita?
Okay, I'm back. So, okay, we have our identified target neighborhoods. And basically, once the target neighborhoods were identified, that led directly into the destination process, or the second leg of the stool. We organized community listening sessions, which Ben was talking about earlier, and this was to figure out what people's preferences were in addition to the literature and the research that we had. Then we established those filters reflecting those preferences. The destinations were then ranked based on the filters, and the destinations were then mapped for spatial analysis in order to identify the potential target destinations. And I will be going through each of these steps in the slides coming up. So we started with the community listening sessions, and Emmeline earlier in her segment talked at length about the different listening sessions, so I'm just going to go over them really quickly. Last summer, Nina Roberts, who is also a core team member, she mobilized her contacts with the communities and got 5 listening sessions scheduled in our target neighborhoods. And this is a picture of a flyer which was made for one of our listening sessions, and this is available as a handout, and it can be used as a template if anyone is interested. So from the listening sessions, some of the key findings include information gaps as a main issue. And again, Emmeline was talking about this, but basically what people were saying were corroborated with the research in the literature, because if transit existed from their community, they didn't know about it. And folks kept asking, what was there to do at the destination? They wanted to know once they got there, what could they do? They also identified that folks were willing to pay an entrance fee if they had information on how that money was going to be used. So that was an interesting bit of information. We also found that distance and convenience was a main concern. Before the listening sessions, the team kept asking questions about how long would people be willing to sit on a bus to get somewhere, like how far is too far. And one of our answers, that actually got answered in our community listening sessions, where we found out that a majority of the folks that participated were willing to travel 2 to 3 hours one way for a day trip. And this became a key piece of information later on for our filters, which you'll see. But overall, the basic results aligned with the literature. We wanted 60 participants. We ended up having 57, which is pretty darn close. And we had a good cross-section of diversity in our groups. The information that Nina Roberts collected is available in the tech memo, as Emmeline said earlier, and that can be found on our Carlos, California website, and Jamie will be posting that URL later in the presentation. So once we verified people's preferences, the team then developed filters to reflect those preferences and ranked them using that dot voting technique. So site amenities got 14 votes. Site activities got 9 votes. Current or planned ATS on site was a little bit of a challenge because we couldn't really measure the planned part of the ATS, so we measured current. The distance from neighborhoods, which got 6 votes, became a critical filter, and I'm going to show that on the map, which is on the next slide. Whether the destinations had relevant on-site programs was important because of the the fact that people wanted to know what activities were available. Iconic destinations started off as a filter, but the team decided to not rank it and keep it through to the end, despite any kind of ranking system, because iconic destinations like Yosemite, for example, are a draw regardless of distance. So I'll be showing that in the next slide as well. And the ability to handle increased visitation ended up being a filter that was dropped because it just became impossible to measure that and rank it. So TripTac helped us with ranking all of these destinations into a huge giant spreadsheet. We had 200 destinations. They included ski areas and visitor centers. They included scenic byways. They even included casinos if the casino had an associated interpretive element with it, like a trail or a visitor center. So once we got on the matrix, then the destinations were mapped to perform a spatial analysis. So here's a map showing our project area, Central California. It also has all the destinations ranked from low to high. Iconic destinations are also on there. They're marked in red, like I said, we separated them out. And the map also shows our 12 target neighborhoods that Ben was talking about. And around each of the neighborhoods is a 45-mile radius circle. And this radius is what the team calculated was representative of a 2-hour ride on transit. We didn't want anyone to, well, we decided to use the 2-hour as our initial distance filter. So now it's just a process of prioritization. So the first cut was the distance filter. So destinations falling outside of the circles were dropped, except for the iconic destinations that were carried through to the end. And we ended from 200, now we're down to about 15 per neighborhood. So first cut. Now the second cut was taking a closer look at each neighborhood. Here we have a map of the Merced neighborhood with the 45-mile radius and all the nearby destinations by ranking. And the team started to identify clusters of destinations. For example, up in the upper right, we have 2 BLM sites, a fish and wildlife site. There is a national park site that ranks high. There's also an iconic destination. There's also other clusters of fish and wildlife sites at the refuges. So once the clusters are identified, the next question is, how do I get there? And we get to the third leg of the stool, which is the transportation piece. So the preferences have already been identified. What was needed now was to map the existing transit and then to spatially determine which, if any, of the existing transportation systems were viable to integrate into our target corridors. So basically, we took the existing transit and we overlaid it onto our neighborhood maps. Again, we have the Merced neighborhood map here, and we have this existing shuttle that goes from Merced out on the dark blue line that goes to Yosemite up in here. We also have the Merced County Transit line, bus line, shown in green here that goes past a couple of the fish and wildlife refuge areas. And then we also have a regional transit a line that goes up to Modesto. So Merced has 3 possible corridors. The red lines show where transit was not available to, or at least it's not, we didn't find it via our sources. So looking at Merced having 3 possible corridors to build off of, we ended up doing this for all 12 neighborhoods, and each neighborhood had about 3 potential corridors each. So we're getting closer to our goal of, well, we were really looking at 5 corridors at the end. But through a lot of prioritization exercises and dot voting and lots of discussion, our team did boil everything down to a final set of priority corridors, which were here, and we ended up with 7, not 5. It was pretty close, but so from 200 destinations and 12 target neighborhoods, we ended up with these 7 corridors. And we did manage to include 8 neighborhoods, although there's 7 corridors, because we joined the Visalia, Fresno, 2 different neighborhoods into the greater Sequoia Loop. Again, not just looking at linear corridors, but like Jamie suggested, trying to get creative with our spatial configurations. Plus, we also, in looking at everything, realized that all the target neighborhoods had Amtrak stations. And we didn't want to lose sight of that as we moved forward, because these could be used as hubs connecting multiple destinations for longer trips, including overnights. And although that wasn't something we were looking at, we were mostly looking at day trips and the 2-hour ride, we didn't want to lose that as we moved forward in the process. So here's a final map showing 3 of our corridors, of our 7 corridors. You can see them, they're in blue. We had the dashed lines show existing transit that we hope to build upon. So we have the South Sacramento to South Lake Tahoe corridor and destinations in between via Highway 50. We have the Bay Area via Stockton corridor to Yosemite with a couple of destinations in between. And we also have our example from earlier, the Merced to Yosemite National Park and other destinations along the way via Highway 140. So, proof of concept, or what is existing on the ground. Well, the students at California State University are currently testing routes along the corridors that we chose. Earlier this year, they did one test, or a set of tests, from the Bayview neighborhood in San Francisco up to Muir Woods in Marin. And involving CSU students is actually a key part of this project, which is not just for, which is more than just field testing our ideas. California State University enrollment comes predominantly from the local community, and the students represent California's cultural diversity. They're like it's like a little UN. It's pretty much, they bring their information and experience, and we're hoping that all the information and experience that they get participating in this project comes back with them to their friends, to their family, to their neighborhoods, and can help bridge the gap between the federal agencies and the local community. So the students looked at a couple of things. They looked at time, how long did it take? They looked at how easy was it to navigate, how safe did it feel, how convenient was it, including frequency and wait time, and whether there was storage for gear, for coolers, for example, or bicycles. They looked at how much did it cost and for en route opportunities. The field test portion of the project, like I said, is not yet completed, but initial findings from this show that although the distance was only 21 miles and it was, would take 1 hour or less by car depending on traffic, it took 4 hours one way to get there. The students divided into 3 groups and they tested 3 different routes. They kind of did a little thing like the TV show The Amazing Race, who's going to get to the destination first. And they tested 4 different systems, including the seasonal park shuttle for the last leg of the journey. And they found that they had up to 50-minute wait times, and coordinating connections was a challenge. And it cost $18 round trip. So overall, it's not like anything is a big surprise. They had a lot of fun doing it, and it was enlightening in a lot of different ways for us and for them. But the challenges that we face have been confirmed and identified on the ground. So what's next for Carlos, California? Well, this summer, we're kicking off the Southern California Phase 2. At the same time, we're wrapping up Tier 1 in Central California, concluding more pilot tests in the Sierras and possibly in the Monterey area. And we're going to start with the Tier 2 corridor planning, taking those 7 corridors into the next phase of planning. And we're going to, continue to move forward as resources emerge for Tier 3, station design and implementation. But we're not leaving implementation all the way to the end. We also have partnered with local nonprofit groups to start filling in those information gaps for transit. For example, we partnered with the Sierra Business Council to put an alternative transportation planner on their existing geotourism website. So I'm going to leave it there for questions, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Anita and Ben. At this time, we'll stop for questions. Again, we're going to use the same method. Either use the Q&A manager, simply type in your question, ask, and we'll read that question for you. Or if you are joining us on the telephone, simply press star 8 on your telephone keypad. And as of right now, it looks like we only have one question, and this is for either Anita or Ben. What would you do to improve upon this process in the future?
I'll take a shot first. One thing I would suggest is running the demographic profile information for each of the census blocks or tracks. If you use that, well, that would be another suggestion. Use census blocks if possible. They're smaller than tracks. But then also do the demographic analysis for each track or block. And as you're selecting the neighborhoods and clusters of these blocks or tracks, adjust the demographic profile in real time so that the dot voting and the prioritizing is informed by that process in real time.
And I guess I would, well, I guess what I would suggest and what some of the lessons learned from this pilot project is to try to time the milestones of the project with potential funding deadlines so that you have enough of the project completed so you can have that information to support your grant application for the next round. And so figuring out that timing is critical. It was really helpful. And it kind of guides your milestone timeline.
All right. It doesn't, at this particular moment, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So, Jamie, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Nathan, Anita, and Ben for sharing your case studies. Now we're going to talk real briefly about a wrap-up from the case studies, what made these case studies work, what were some of the lessons learned, and what filters were used so that you could use them in your area as well. So what makes the fish wildlife concepts work? It was regional planning, so regionally based. They identified low-hanging fruit or things that could be put into play or implemented with minor changes or that have an impact, a major impact for low cost or low effort. And they also looked at transportation, again, not only within their refuges, but connecting to their refuges as well. And this concept, there was proof that it worked in the fact that this was used also as the basis for what was done in Carlos, California. So some of the lessons learned both from the rates and the long-range transportation plans done by Fish Wildlife were that it pays benefits in the short term. It was these were helpful for them to choose transportation projects and make project selections using the rate analysis in order to put these transportation recommendations into their long-range transportation plans. And it also allowed them to implement rather quickly the actions that were recommended. The other lesson learned for Fish Wildlife was that it helped them implement some of their agency-wide and transportation-specific initiatives. And when they talk about that, some of those were that there were more households without access to private vehicles than Fish Wildlife originally thought. There were economic issues that impact public lands access, and they're relevant in rural areas as well as the urban neighborhoods. So it allowed them to carry those over to rural areas as well. And also the revelation that transportation use patterns are changing, and this needs to be considered at all levels of planning. For Carlos, California, what made this project work? It was mission aligned with all of the different lands agencies that participated in the project. There was current as well as potential funding available for this project. There were different levels of professionals used. There were the experienced professionals and stakeholders, as well as the next generation, which were those university students from California State. And also the engagement of multiple different stakeholders, both agency-wide, in the community, and then the use of campus. So again, for you to implement this in your agency, in your region, this is the flowchart we showed earlier, again, just as a reminder that first neighborhoods were chosen, and then destinations. Then alternative transportation systems were figured out, and the gaps in between were identified. And to do this, filters were used for each of these things, and these are a look back at what those filters were so that you could potentially use these same ones or come up with additional ones for your unit as well. The demographic filters that were used for the rates in fish wildlife were median income, vehicles per household, and minority. And for Carlos, you can see that all three of these were used as well as food stamp recipients and age. The destination filters that were chosen to be carried through to pick destinations were site amenities, site activities, current or planned alternative transportation systems at the location, and relevant on-site programs. Some general lessons learned for the Carlos, California project. Anita just mentioned the project milestones and making sure that they are, that the milestones are projected against the future funding deadlines and how that assists with grant applications. Another thing was to incorporate the Metropolitan Planning Organization boundaries into the project boundaries. The first shot that we took at aligning Central California project boundaries was to use major transportation roadways. And then when we overlaid that with the Metropolitan Planning Organization boundaries, we shifted the Central California project boundary a little bit so that it would match the MPO boundaries to make it easier to coordinate with the MPOs in the area. Making sure that you honor the commitment to transparency in the group voting and decision-making process, and making sure that everyone in the extended team is able to participate in the group voting and that it's not being changed so that just the core group makes these decisions. Another lesson learned was to keep an ongoing lessons learned journal or list to make sure that you knew what to put through for the next phases of the project. So when we're taking this for Carlos, Southern California, and Carlos, Northern California as well. Making sure that when you're doing outreach and doing your focus groups that you have time and funding budgeted for translation and interpretive services for these listening sessions and focus groups. And then, as Anita mentioned earlier, one of our destination filters started as being iconic locations, and we ended up carrying those particular locations through to the end because we thought of those ones as the overnight trips. They were the destinations that people knew and were going to want to go to, and so that may be something you consider to do as well. We decided to use the 45-mile buffer that was discussed earlier and to filter out some of the destinations, and this we assumed to be about 2 hours via transit. We considered transit loops and not just linear corridors, so if there was multiple ways to get from one origin to a destination, and also a loop to go between them, and not just going from one to the other and back again on the same road. And then the most practical implementation pieces, when you get to that point, may be the low-hanging fruit. So to make sure that you're looking at the last mile and the middle mile, to improve things such as scheduling, to possibly just enhance interpretation, or to expand your information outreach that you're using as well. And so those are some of the wrap-ups for the 2 case studies that we heard. And I'll turn it to Stephanie.
Okay, Jamie, it looks like we have one quick question before we move on to the next section. It says, have you identified appropriate and adequate funding sources for phase 2 and 3?
And I will let Anita handle that question. Anita? Maybe she's on mute. Phase.
I just had to get off mute. Sorry, guys. The question was, how will we handle funding for phase 2 and 3? Phase 2, which is Southern California, is already funded. We did get, we were awarded a TRIP award. I think that was 2011 for that, and so that's going to start. We're going to kick that off this summer. And for phase 3, Northern California, we still haven't gotten there. We're still in the process of trying to focus on phase 1 and 2. And one of the things we were trying to actually do was combine phases 1 and 2, Central California and Southern California, funding-wise, so that we could take it a little further than just the Tier 1, which is the transportation network area, but really get further along to the corridor planning phase and eventually the station implementation. Tier and the station implementation tier. So you have the phases, which is the geographical phases, and the tiers, which is more of the scale of planning. And we're trying to get and drill down more into the tiers of planning, the scale, before we tackle another geographical phase. I hope that was not too confusing, but
all right. I think that's good. And with that, I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Jamie.
Thank you. So now we've talked a lot about the planning process, but what about implementation? So I'm going to talk about a few programs that exist already to encourage public land use and also to encourage connecting underserved neighborhoods with the public lands. I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Park Service Call to Action, and then some national programs that are available and a couple specific examples that you might be able to implement yourself. So the National Park Service, a call to action, was put forth in August of 2011 by the National Park Service Director, and this was directed at coming up with 36 actions that the National Park Service could take for the next 100 years due to the fact that they're going to be celebrating their centennial in 2016. And three of these 36 actions are focused on things that we've been talking about the underserved communities. And these are In My Backyard, which was called Service Action Number 4. And this one is to improve urban residents' knowledge of and access to outdoor and cultural experiences close to home by ensuring that every national park located in an urban area has a well-promoted physical connection to the public transportation system or to a pedestrian and bicycle path. Parks for People is number 5, and that one is to enhance the connection of densely populated, diverse communities to parks, greenways, trails, and waterways to improve close-to-home recreation and natural resources conservation. And the third one is the Stop Talking and Listening, which is called Action Number 13. And this one is to learn about the challenges and opportunities associated with connecting diverse communities to the great outdoors and our collective history. And each of those is actually a little bit longer description to them, but I read you a shorter version so that you could get an idea of what they are. For the In My Backyard call to action, there are a few examples of things that they've put into place already. Saguaro National Park Friends Group provides transportation funding for environmental education programs for kids, and the guidelines for receiving this funding are focused on the underserved or underrepresented schools in the area. The Grant Corps Ranch provides free summer youth camps. And these, again, are aimed at local underserved youth or low-income families. And it provides hands-on natural and cultural activities for these children. And then Pinnacles National Park has a Let's Move Outside and Into Our Parks program, where they provide 3 hours of physical activities for the children to do. And again, these activities are targeted toward low-income and at-risk youth. For the Parks and People program, some examples here are a bike share program that is provided, and these bikes are used also by the Youth Heritage Treks program, which is a program to help familiarize underserved students with the recreation resources in their area. There's a Youth Ambassadors program at the Star Spangled Banner National Historical Trail, which has hired 5 youth to do maintenance projects at that National Historical Trail. But it also focuses on providing them with an educational and outdoor recreation experiences as well. So they do things such as taking the youth on camping expeditions. And then there is, the last example was a creation of a boardwalk trail that allowed a community, a rather diverse community, to be able to get across the Potomac River to some wetland habitat that was not easily accessed without the trail. The Stop Talking and Listening, these ones are focus groups or community forums similar to the ones that were the listening sessions that were done in Carlos, California, and these were done at Saguaro National Park and also at Yosemite National Park. Some other programs that you might be interested in looking up and see if you could use some of the things that they do are the Healthy Parks and Healthy People National Park Service Initiative and America's Great Outdoors, which is an initiative brought forth by President Obama. And both of these are focused on physical activity and conservation of lands. The Let's Move Outside program is a Department of the Interior program for helping families develop a more active lifestyle, and this also is focused more on physical activity. The Complete Streets and Safe Routes to Schools programs are there to help increase safety to allow for alternative means of getting to places by using physical activity. And the Breaking the Barriers program is also a National Park Service collaborative, and this is geared towards underserved communities and breaking down cultural and economic barriers to allow them to participate in outdoor activities. Again, some very specific ideas that you might be able to put into place. The transitandtrails.org is a website that's run by the Bay Area Open Space Council, and this is a way for you to find alternative transportation systems to get to a public land from your origin. The East Bay Regional Park District provides low-cost transportation to low-income school groups, so that might be something that can be put into place. Cycles of Change is a program that provides bikes for field trips. The Amtrak California Kids and Trains program is a program to allow children to have reduced fares for schools and youth groups in California. Another program that's been done is converting park roadways to car-free on weekends, and you may have heard of this as being called other things such as a Sunday Parkway or Summer Streets or Scenic Sundays. And one thing that they found at Golden Gate National Recreation Area when they've put this into play is that not only are the benefits of this program increasing physical activity, reducing air pollution, but it's also increased attendance at their park. And once they've gone car-free, they found that they have 2.5 million more users annually just due to this program. Another example of a program that's been put in place is at Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge. They have a program called Going Wild, Rail to Refuge. And this program allows you to ride the rail with a ranger to have interpretation done while you're doing that and looking at the refuge. And then there are also bike share programs in multiple locations such as Boston, Denver, Minnesota, and Virginia that allow you to access public lands as well. For more information, because we had to go through that piece rather quickly as well, you can look up the call to action at www.nps.gov/call-to-action, and there's actually a system where you can search for any of the calls to action and find examples of what they're doing to put those into place. There's an article on bike sharing that was available that talked specifically about some particular ways to reach underrepresented groups using bike sharing. And then the rest, many of the other examples came from two particular documents, one called Transportation Challenges and Opportunities, and the other called Serving Culturally Diverse Visitors to Forests in California. So I wanted to provide those with you as well if you wanted some more details on those programs.
Okay, Jamie, I think we'll just go ahead and continue on since we have just the summary left.
Yep. Sounds good. So in summary, we did talk about what an underserved community is, and again, it's demographic, geographic, and economic characteristics that prevent a community from being able to do something. And a lot of those characteristics include low income or age, mobility impairment, and minority groups. We went over what was used for the regional planning, and the one that I did leave off the top of this list was to identify your stakeholders. That was the very first thing we talked about. And then creating memorandums of understanding, making sure that you identify your project outcomes by identifying visions, goals, and objectives, picking what your project boundaries are going to be that both what types of alternative transportation systems you're going to use, and what level of the public lands you're going to be looking at as well, and then also your geographical boundaries for your project. We talked about determining your neighborhoods and how to use both the Fish, Wildlife and the Carlos, California mapping to do that. How to identify recreation preferences, and we talked, Emmeline showed you what some of those were, and Anita went over how the focus groups went for the Carlos, California project, and then how to determine your destination using your filters and prioritizing them as well. Lastly, we talked about determining what the alternative transportation system corridors are and how to do a proof of concept pilot test to be able to figure out where your gaps are. And lastly, a final report will be created for Carlos, California, including the prioritized list that Anita went over. For the implementations, we went through some examples that exist, and this is a general overview of them. So provide transportation funding for underserved community, provide youth educational opportunities, making sure that bike share programs can be specifically targeted at underserved communities, implementing trails, providing websites with detailed information on them, having car-free events, and having interpretive programs on alternative transportation systems. And if you still have additional questions, we'll take those in a minute, but a few last available resources for you are the Carlos, California website, TripCheck's website, and the Volpe Center's website. And again, all of the links that we've provided in this presentation should be available for you in the handout section as well.
Okay, and with that, that's the conclusion of today's presentation. I'm going to open up the floor for anybody if you have any additional questions or thoughts or comments for the presenters today. Simply use that Q&A manager that we've been talking about this afternoon, or simply pressing *8 on your telephone keypad. As a reminder, as Jamie just said, as you're typing in those remainder questions, use the handout section to download a copy of today's presentation, as well as a few additional handouts the presenters has provided you, and that is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen under the three little white sheets of paper. And it looks like we have just one comment so far. It says, Julie says, thank you. It was great and an interesting presentation. And it doesn't, and I'm going to give it another few seconds to see if anybody has any additional questions as waiting. Just as a reminder, if you would like to visit the TripTech website is shown, or need to contact someone, the phone number, email, and web address are shown on the screen. And it looks like we have a couple questions that just popped in. It says, are you aware of any other national forests who have conducted similar research?
Okay.
This is Ben. I don't know of any other forests that have conducted this kind of work, but I do know of some that are interested. I believe that Carlos, California, really is the first initiative to focus on this as an issue and involve the forests and other FLMAs in this type of work.
Okay, the next question is, how did you compile the list of programs for the National Park Service?
The call to action examples I found off of the call to action website, and I searched by the three that were relevant to this webinar.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So again, I would like...
Stephanie, this is Nathan.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I just realized I got an email from somebody during the meeting, during the webinar, and I do want to correct something. Our Region 2, which is based in Albuquerque and is Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma, as Ben Rasmussen probably knows, has done a rate and does have an ongoing long-range transportation plan. And that's a huge oversight on my part not to get that included, because we're doing some very important work, especially in Albuquerque, the new refuges coming on down there. The Valle de Oro, our newest urban refuge, and actually the refuge manager is one of the Fish and Wildlife Service representatives on this call. So thanks for asking that question, Jennifer, and for allowing me to clarify a real glaring oversight that somehow made it past like 3 or 4 levels of review here. So I just want to make sure, yes, we are doing this across the country. We do have one going on in our Southwest region. So thank you, Jennifer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. It doesn't look like we have any additional... every time I say that, another question comes in. It says, there is another program in the National Park Service that carries out the call to action initiatives you mentioned, called the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, that helps communities with conservation and outdoor recreation projects. More info is at the nps.gov/RTCA. Thank you, Emily, for that. And we have another question. Ben, this is sort of directed at you. What is the mission of the Volpe Center?
World domination, but that's another matter.
Oh, no, that's not our expressed purpose. No, we assist all public agencies, local, state, and federal, in transportation planning. We're both staff extension and also technical experts in various areas, but we can only work with public entities.
And just what I jokingly referred to world domination, the Volpe Center has been very involved with almost all the efforts, the long-range transportation plans, rates, valuations of the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit and the Parks programs. So they as well as TripTech have been major resources for the federal lands, along with the federal land highway programs, in implementing a broad range of transportation programs, including transit and trails to all public lands, including refuges. So we're very grateful to them.
Thank you.
Okay, I know I'm going to say this and a question is going to pop through, but I think with that we will, since we're at that 3 o'clock hour, we're going to sign off and say thank you everybody for joining us today for the presentation on regional planning to provide underserved communities access to public lands. Please keep a lookout in your email for a survey. With that, we're going to sign off and say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen.